Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and welcome to today's video. In this demonstration, we're going to be working on the Arachnomorphette, the female counterpart of the Arachnomorph Alpha, which we went over last week. Well, we went over the head portrait for the Arachnomorph Alpha, and the previous week before that we went over the Arachnomorph Alpha, the full character concept. So now we're doing the full character concept for the female Arachnomorph. And we're starting her out in very much the same way we started out the male version, which is with a very rough, extremely rudimentary sketch. And I keep it rough and I keep it very, very light because I want to give myself some room to explore here. We're dealing with some creatures that no one else has ever seen before. They've never been created. I'm coming up with these purely out of the depths of my imagination. And so I'm not even sure myself exactly how they're going to look. And that's fantastic. That's when you're in the crux of the creative process. When you're letting your mind just wander to see what it might come up with. And you'll put that down onto the page. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't work. But the fact that you're keeping it rough and you're keeping it light, nothing is really set in stone, gives you the freedom and takes the pressure off of you having to come up with something that you can't take back off of the page, right? Everything you place down is just a test. It's a little tiny experiment. Every single line you put down onto the canvas. And it's a nice thing to be able to think of drawing in this way, because I think that personally for me it fully encompasses what it means to be a creative person, what it means to be somebody who does come up with something and puts it down on the page, spawning it purely out of nowhere just through their imagination alone. That's the dream as a creative, and that's really what pushes me to draw every single day, that feeling of creativity that courses through your veins and splurges out onto the page. And there's no other feeling quite like it, which is why I think I've stuck with drawing for so long. But once that basic, rough and rudimentary draft is on the page and there's enough there for me to work with, to refine, to noodle out the finer details, I will create, actually in this case I didn't create another layer above that sketch, I just started working right over the top of it, defining the lines that I wanted to keep with a much heavier contour and erasing the ones that weren't quite working. So I'm kind of building off of that sketch now. I'm sculpting it out, I'm refining it, I'm increasing the level of clarity so that I can create a clearer representation of the ultimate concept that we're leading toward here. And I really loved this particular character because it was an opportunity for me to express the primal, animalistic nature of the Arachnomorph species. And as you can see, she is not to be messed with. Ultimately, when she's done, you're going to see that she's holding some innocent victim's, human victim's head in her grasp. You know, these arachnomorphs, they love to hunt humans in the post-apocalyptic earth that they inhabit. And they certainly aren't merciful creatures. They really do enjoy and got a lot of fun out of hunting down the last of the human species. They're kind of like, I like to compare them and to think of them as the Predator from the Predator movies starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. I think of them as hunters, as these tribal, primal creatures that are just absolutely savage to the core. And so a lot of their attire and the kind of clothing that they're going to be wearing is going to reflect that. The way in which the furry areas of their bodies, and there are certain parts of their design that are covered in hair, are decorated and styled and designed. You can see there that she's kind of got these almost dreadlocks that are hanging off the sides of her head there and at the back, and then they're tied together with these very decorative type jewels, I guess. I'm not exactly sure what they're made of. Probably something that the arachnomorph has kind of gathered just lying around the land and put together and fashioned into some sort of decoration, twigs and stone and that kind of thing. And so, these are the thoughts that I go through. I really do try to think about, hey, what would it be like to be this creature? And what, as a result, would they wear? How would they go about their day? If I was David Attenborough doing a documentary on this creature, looking at it through the lens of a camera, what would I see? How would it act? What kind of habits would it have as a species? And so I'm trying to think about these things to inform the design that I'm developing here, because that in and of itself is going to help to further the idea that I've already got down onto the page in a rudimentary fashion. And so this is really the refinement process that I'm going through. And in order to refine it, I have to have that information at least considered on a basic level in order to come up with something that looks convincing, appealing, and makes sense to the audience. Because if you have a design that doesn't make any sense, it doesn't really work in a logical way, then that's going to not only be distracting for the audience in a negative light, but also it's just going to cause them to disconnect from the artwork altogether. They won't be able to understand it. And so everything that you add into your designs, into your illustrations, into your drawings, whatever it is, it all needs to be consistent with itself. It needs to be congruent, because any areas of conflict where the idea begins to fall apart will cause an instant disconnect for your audience. And it'll also be more confusing for you as the creator as well to consolidate the drawing altogether. You yourself won't be able to know which direction to go in next, because there wouldn't have been any direction established or considered in the first place. So this is also part of the fun of design, of drawing characters and creating them, again, purely from your imagination, is that you do get to really immerse yourself in the character and their backstory. You get to be a part of that. And it's not just the visual manifestation that you draw down onto the page that you get to be the author of, but you also get to have some say in who that character is beyond the page. You get to have some say into what they are, not just in a physical representation that you've depicted in your illustration, but also what kind of stories that are going to surround this character later on. Because, being a comic book illustrator, and if you're watching this video, you're probably on the path of becoming a comic book illustrator yourself. This is really what we do. We tell stories through our artwork. And so neither of these components to being a comic book artist are separate. They go hand in hand. Everything you draw must have some level of story to it, because you're visually communicating that narrative in whatever it is you do. So even if whether we're talking about a character who is a humanoid or a character which is a creature, which is clearly what we're drawing up here, I guess we're drawing a humanoid creature in a sense, which kind of makes it even more fun, because you get to think about it in, beyond just the social ramifications of whatever character you're drawing, and you get to actually jump into the, what this species is, and again, what kind of, hunting habits are they going to have, mating habits are they going to have. Again, we're dealing with a male and a female arachnomorph here. I'm sure it's not a pretty sight, but, also the way, what kind of food sources they're going to eat. And in this case it's humans, among the other living creatures, what kind of environment they dwell in. All of this not only draws in your audience, but it draws you into the idea, and it gets you invested. And that's a really awesome feeling to have, because you get to be a part of that story. I mean, you're really crafting it as you draw it out. And the more that you consider it, the more that the story will be reflected through in the finished line work that is going to be depicting and presenting your characters. So now I'm going through and I'm adding more of these decorative kind of bracelets and ties around the Arachnomorphette's arm. She's got a big giant claw there, and you can see that I've kind of roughly drawn out this tree branch that she's going to be sitting in. And so I was thinking about, well, how would she maneuver if she was animated? If I was to hit the play button here and I was able to watch her move around, how would she move? In my mind, I had it, if you've ever seen one of those, tribal dances, they kind of have a lot of fluidity to their body. They've got this very interesting and unique energy about them. And so I wanted to mix that with, a creaturely type movement, whatever that means. Just something that was very alien and almost disturbing to look at. It didn't quite move like a human, even though it had these human-like qualities, these humanoid assets that made up its design. We're looking at a creature here, but still, even though she has multiple limbs, many of those limbs take after the limbs of a human being. It's just that she's got a few extra ones, right? So it's very interesting to kind of, again, contemplate this stuff. Again, think about, okay, not only are we talking about how this character looks, we're not just concerned with their backstory and what they actually are, but we also now want to know, okay, how do they move? Like, what does this creature look like if we were to bring it to life? If we were to, again, watch it through the lens of a David Attenborough documentary. And then I try to visualize that. I try to hit the play button in my mind's eye and view it, observe it. And then the trick is the challenge is to try to incorporate that and suggest it as much as possible, whatever it is I'm seeing in my mind, into that finished drawing, into the movement of the lines, into the pose of this creature, and to somehow be able to do that effectively enough to have it come across as clearly as possible to the audience. And that's the trickiest part of this entire thing, is to be able to translate what I'm seeing in my head down onto the page and then have the audience understand it in the same way. Because we all have our different points of view. We all have our own ways of understanding the things that we're able to see, especially when it comes to comic art. We're all going to process it in a different way. It's going to mean something different to all of us. And if you're an effective artist, if you're an effective visual communicator, you'll be able to control exactly what that perception is. And the closer their perception is to your perception, the more successful you are as an artist. Because if your purpose was to present a certain thing and then to the audience, but then they see something completely different, then you haven't fulfilled your mission. The goal hasn't been met. Your purpose for creating this illustration in the first place is fundamentally not successful. So the important thing is to be able to incorporate enough information into your artwork that the audience can relate with then, so that they don't miss a beat, so that they do understand it without a doubt in their mind as to what it is they're looking at. But beyond the, I guess you could say, the inner game stuff concerning creature design, what we want to look at also is the techniques here that we're using to actually execute the drawing. And this is the stuff that we all get excited about, including me. The comic book techniques that actually make the drawing look cool and draw the audience in the first place. So what are we dealing with here? Well, for the most part, the Arachnomorphette, because she's a female, she's going to have a less amount of shadow incorporated into her design, just because she's got a little less detail there. There's less definition in her muscle mass, especially in comparison to the Arachnomorph Alpha. And there's also less detail there that we're dealing with as well because, she is a female, so we want to try to have that femininity come across within her, even though she's very much a savage, not to be messed with, merciful creature of death. So it's a bit of a balance here because we want her to look scary, but we also want her to look somewhat feminine and sleek in a way. And again, the movement is going to come into that too. So, as she is moving across this tree branch, you can see that her arms and her claws are all, kind of dabbing into the bark of the tree branch so that she can keep herself steady, so that she can stabilize. So I'm really trying to think about, okay, how fast does she move and what kind of stance is she going to need to compose herself into in order to remain upright as she maneuvers herself from one tree branch to the next, whilst holding a human head in her grasp. You can see also as well that this pose that she's in is very she's ready to attack whatever it is she is looking at. She's not backing down whatsoever. She's, if you see the Arachnomorphette in this particular position, you know that you should run as fast as you possibly can away from her in the opposite direction. So, but again, the line work itself, you can see that because there's a lack of detail and a lack of rendering and shadow in the interior contours articulating the anatomy and whatnot, what we then depend on for a female character especially is slick, sharp-looking, energetic line weights that are going to give a nice, beautiful visual appeal to the primary outline of the character. And so, in order to be able to do that, the key thing that you need to keep in mind with line weights is that they really are there to serve three purposes. And usually it's going to be either one or two of these three purposes, or maybe even all three of them together. But the three purposes are to just create a nice amount of variation to the line to make it look good, to make it look appealing to the eye. And that's just simple, thick and light variation, thick and thin variation along the trajectory of the contour that is encompassing whatever particular part of the character you're working on. And if you can get a nice rhythmic flow to that line where it runs from thick to thin in just the right way, then you will have created just in and of itself a professional, pro-looking aesthetic to your work. It is amazing the amount of quality that you can add into your work just through the outline alone, through the implementation of line weights. It was a huge game changer for me when I learned about it, and it was a very simple shift. It didn't take a whole lot for me to implement it whatsoever. And if you can do the same, you'll notice the same dramatic increase in quality within your work that I experienced. So the second key when it comes to line weights is that you want to try to make them thicker around the outer curves of the line. So, for example, around her outer thigh and around her knee there, you can see that the line kind of picks up in thickness as it runs around these particular areas and encompasses them. Where there's one line overlapping another, you'll also want to increase the thickness of that line weight. The areas in which you'll want to keep it thin are really the parts of the form that are going to be picking up the most light. So they're in direct light. And this is where line weights can be used in a way to suggest the lighting setup of your illustration. You can see that thigh there that I was just working on, underneath the thigh, the inner thigh there, you can see that there's a nice thick outline around the bottom of it. But then at the top, that line thins out. It's a significantly thinner line with less heaviness implemented upon it. And so what you get is this representation of where the light source is shining down onto the character from, and it helps to indicate the kind of environmental lighting conditions in which we're presenting the character. Very, very useful for just again, it's all about implication, implying that there's a light source there without really having to incorporate a whole lot of rendering or shadow to go along with it. Line weights alone can be enough to indicate a light source. Now you can see that I'm detailing out the head of the character, of the human, the poor soul that has run into this very violent and temperamental, probably, Arachnomorphette. It's a little bit disturbing to look at, and hey, but it really does kind of get the point across as to the kind of creature that we're dealing with here. So back to the line weights, of course, the other way in which line weights can be used are just to emphasize certain forms, right? So say that there's a certain area that we want to look at or draw attention to within the character design, we're going to give that particular area a thicker outline because it's just going to draw more attention. It's emphasizing it and essentially framing it with this emboldened outline that's going to pull whoever is looking at the illustration here. It's going to pull their attention directly to that point, even if it's surrounded by a bunch of detail. So line weights can be used to create this visual, hierarchy almost of attention, and then on top of that, depth, because anything with a thicker outline is also going to look closer. So when it comes to things like foreshortening, if you really want to have that particular foreshortened area of anatomy or form just pop out of the page, then the closer it's getting to the viewer, the more it's popping out. You want to thicken up the outline of that particular forefront portion of the form. And as it recedes back, that line will get lighter and lighter. And then, of course, on top of that, we've got a bunch of rendering and detail. And when it comes to female characters in particular, what I like to do is leave any exposed areas of the body with a minimal amount of detail. Now, there's a little bit here, because the Arachnomorphette is kind of hunched over there. We're going to see some more rendering around the base of her belly just to articulate some of the forms to imply that we are seeing some shadow there. But for the most part, her thighs, there's barely any rendering there other than, maybe around the bottom. There's barely any rendering on her arms. There's some in the shaded areas of the form, but not too much. And, we do want to try to keep it minimal. We certainly don't want, at least in comparison, as much shadow and cross-hatching as we're seeing in the Arachnomorph Alpha, her male counterpart. So then where does the detail come from? Why does this illustration still look so darn detailed? Well, most of it comes from the clothing or the attire that the Arachnomorphette is wearing. You can see that in and of itself is very, very intricate. We're dealing with, lots of different... Again, I'm not really sure what the material is of these decorative elements that are wrapped around her limbs, but I'm guessing they're made of leathers, maybe they're made of the hide of humans or something eerie like that. But whatever it's made of, it is incorporating an additional level of intricacy within these portions of her design that cause her to look much more detailed. And it also introduces a heightened level of contrast to these areas. We've got the busyness of the decorative elements around her arms and the jewelry and the ties of leathered human skin around her body there as well. And then we've also got her fur that's wrapped around her butt there and her hair. But other than that, we've got these exposed areas of skin which in comparison are relatively light. And so we've got this nice rhythm of light tones and dark tones. If you squint your eyes, you can see that much more clearly. And what happens is that the lighter areas of the design actually pop out to us a little bit further in contrast to those darker areas as a result. And using tone in this way allows us to direct the viewer's eye around the illustration. But, that was very, very quick, and it's sad that the illustration has come to an end already. I barely feel like we got a chance to really jump in depth with this one, but never fear, there will be another illustration of the Arachnomorphette coming up next week, where we'll zoom in on her face and draw a much more detailed representation of how that's going to look. It's going to be a super fun one as well, so I can't wait for you to join me so that we can check it out and go through it together. But for now, if you'd like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to check out www.howtodrawcomics.net. You'll find a bunch of written tutorials over on the site that cover things like perspective and placing people in perspective. We've got an eye tutorial, a nose tutorial, tutorials on heads, and even vehicles. We've got a couple cars and motorcycle tutorials over there, things which I'm admittingly not that great at drawing, so luckily one of our wonderful writers, Joe Catapano, has put in the time and the effort to actually do up a very comprehensive series of tutorials on those topics. We've got videos, an entire video library, which is essentially all the videos here that you're getting on YouTube, but all in one place, that we've created for howtodrawcomics.net. And we've got a podcast. Can you believe that? We've even got a podcast, which is super cool and a very inspiring and informative comic art resource in and of itself. And then once you've gone through all of that free content, if you'd like to delve deeper into the art of comic book illustration, then I'd highly recommend that you check out our course selection. We've got my courses, of course, which focus more on character design for comic books, such as my latest superheroines course, and then one on figure drawing foundations, proportions. We've also got Ed Foychuk's courses, which are a little bit more aimed at beginners who want to learn about anatomy and perspective, and we've even got one on drawing animals by Ed Foychuk. Super cool stuff, and Ed really drills down into that content and lays it out in a very simple, easy to understand and replicatable way. And then we've also got Robert Marzullo's courses over there, who, if you're watching this channel, you probably are already aware of. He's got loads and loads of courses on all things to do with comics, drawing heads and figure drawing as well. He's also got a perspective course, tons and tons of content there for you to check out. Highly suggest that you at least take a look and peruse through that course selection just to see if something takes your fancy. Other than that, thanks so much for watching. It's been an absolute pleasure. Until next time, keep on creating, keep on practicing, and I'll see you in the next video.